Pollack, welcome to the Glenn Show.
Hey, Glenn. Good to talk to you.
Seems like we've been doing this quite a bit in the last couple of months. I think this might be the third time in 2 months that you and I have sat for a conversation.
Yeah.
What do you think that's all about?
Well, there's a lot going on, and I think it's an honor for me to talk to you. I must say, when it's toughened me up to read the comments afterwards below us on the.
Well, let that be a lesson to you, Pollack.
Yeah.
You know, the commentators at this website are often perceptive, and they are always energetic consumers of our talk. So if they tell you that you've gone on too long or that you're off base or whatever, you ought to at least consider that. Take that seriously. I do.
I did get a haircut for this one, so I'm ready to go.
Okay, so I just got a haircut myself, literally. Just came from the barber this morning, so we're even. Okay, Harold, what are we talking about? We're talking about the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's annual convention and speeches given by presidential aspirants, in particular Mitt Romney, at this year's gathering, which took place last week. And the intriguing speculations that you have engaged in as to what you think Mitt Romney ought to have said at the NAACP convention. And let me just introduce this by observing that the NAACP, which is the oldest and most prominent civil rights organization advocating on behalf of African American civic equality, has been in years past a site where leading politicians have come to make big pronouncements of particular interest to the African American community. So what with President Obama being an African American, and what with Mitt Romney not really expecting to get much support from black people in this upcoming election, we have a particularly keen interest in hearing what it is that this conservative Republican might have to say at the NAACP convention. And I'll acknowledge that I have a particular interest in hearing what it is that you think he ought to have said at that convention, including, Harold, why it is that you give a darn one way or the other about what a guy that I'm sure you're not going to vote for says to a bunch of people whom he is sure are not going to vote for him. So that's our subject, Harold. Why don't you get us started anyway by in your own words, telling us what you think Mitt Romney ought to have said and why.
Yeah, that sets the context. So, Mitt Romney goes there, and in a sense, he's Daniel in the lion's den, although the lions aren't actually going to do anything to hurt him. And he gives a speech which is clearly the people in the hall are the stage extras for the real speech, which is really going out to a wider audience. Some part of the audience are moderate whites that don't want to see him be overly exclusionary, and part of it is a more conservative base who want to see him be willing to go up and say some straight things to people they disagree with. He gets some boos inside the hall, and when you look at the speech that he wrote, it seems pretty calculated to at least produce some of those boos. You don't go before an African-American audience and expressly criticize Obamacare using the words Obamacare, as Mike Tomasky and Rich Yesselson note, unless you want to get booed. And so he got that. And so...
Oh, wait a minute. So he's responsible for the boos because he baited the audience.
Baiting may be... I think baiting may be a little bit... I don't know that I would use the word baiting, but I would say that he used vocabulary that he knew was going to elicit a really negative reaction. He could have said the Affordable Care Act. He could have had any number of ways to refer to health reform. And he sort of threw in a rather disparaging comment and... under the moniker of Obamacare, there are speechwriters who sit around and think about how is the audience going to respond to every semicolon in this thing, and they obviously made that decision.
Every editorial writer in the country uses the phrase Obamacare. I'm not sure why Romney's reflexive use of it, and this is no defense of Romney, necessarily reflects some kind of calculation on his part. If he had said anything other than Obamacare, it would have been a glaring departure from the mode of discourse in which he has made reference to the health care reform policy debate heretofore. That would have then been worth commentary. If he would have been pandering to the audience or patronizing them if he had avoided using the same language that he uses when he speaks to other audiences about this subject. Don't you think?
Well, I think that I'll let people who've seen the video clip draw their own conclusions, but it seems to me that there's a kind of conversation you have with people when you're really trying to persuade them and engage with them, and there's a kind of conversation that you have with people when you're throwing up a bunch of your talking points and you don't really care how they respond, or you're certainly willing to see them respond in a negative way. And there's for one thing, it seems to me that almost any African American audience was going to react really negatively to the whole way that he framed that. First of all, the casual way that he brought up the issue of health reform and health policy was itself a real problem when you consider that 21% of African Americans are uninsured, and when so many African Americans depend on Medicare and Medicaid and so on. And I mean, these are substantively, there's a real issue that whether or not the Affordable Care Act is the best answer. It's a huge issue in the African American community for millions of people. So there's that issue. Then there's also, it does seem to me that, I guess I'll just leave it there and just say that it seemed to me it was pretty obvious that he was talking past them. And
let's stipulate that he had more than one audience when he spoke to the NAACP. Let me just observe that he was there. Okay. The President of the United States was too busy to speak to the NAACP. Okay? The President knows that he's going to get the black votes. Romney knows that he's not going to get them. Okay? The President may have had another audience in mind when he elected not to speak. That is, the audience that may have reacted to the fact of his speaking in a way that would have been adverse to the President's aspirations. So is the President taking African Americans for granted by not deigning to show up at the annual convention? And if so, is that not an offense of a comparable magnitude to Mitt Romney's looking over the shoulders of his audience and recognizing that a lot of people whom he hopes will turn out to support him are going to be listening to what he said there?
Well, it's certainly not an equal offense, but I think it does point out that it's a real problem that for our politics, that there's such a correlation between people's race, ethnicity, and people's party affiliation. I mean, African Americans are kind of in a unique situation where they're so firmly in the Democratic column, and B, where there's so much what I might call is race conservatism in America, that it becomes a delicate issue of how much any particular politician wants to identify themselves with African American perspectives and constituencies. I mean, it's really striking to me that there's almost no other constituency in America. I guess the LBGT would be another one, but where there's a real sense of negativity if one gets strong support from that group, and that's just a sad place where we are in American politics.
I'm sorry, Harold, I can't agree with that, and I'm not trying to be argumentative. You get negative play in the Northeast of the United States if you're supported by evangelical Christians. If Bible thumpers, quote unquote, turn out in large numbers and in enthusiasm for your speeches and vote for you at the polls in large numbers, then there's certain regions of the country in which that's a discrediting fact about your political aspiration.
I don't think it's nearly as. I'm sure that happens. You know, I'm sitting here on the east side of New York City, and I'm sure that that's true in the particular congressional district of my hotel. But I think that it is not true in a numerically significant.
What about
sense
working class?
America.
What about working class whites who reside in southern jurisdictions? The ones who have not only conservative social values but conservative political values, and yes, who may not share our enlightened, quote-unquote, attitudes about race. What about if they turn out for you in large numbers? That doesn't discredit you in certain places?
I really don't think that it does. I mean, I think if you look at the popularity of Bill Clinton, for example, all around the country, I just think that I'm sure that there's an element of that, but that you and I live in a social stratum where it seems way more, where the distinction that you're drawing seems way more compelling than it does to just about any other demographic. I mean, so so I'll leave it there.
Okay. So let's move forward. You were telling me about what Mitt Romney ought to have said to the NAACP. I was lamenting the fact that the president wasn't there. You were saying, however, Mitt Romney's manipulation of the audience by your lights was a worse offense than the president's selective non-appearance in the interest of his own political aspiration.
So, I actually think it's an interesting question. What should Romney have done there? I mean, first of all, he was not gonna win the votes of the people in that hall, and he's not gonna. President Obama won 94% of the African American vote in 2008. He's certainly going to win a similar percentage in 2012, and so yeah, it's nice that Romney showed up, but what kind of speech might he have given? And it seems to me that he could have given a speech which gave an explanation of why a segment of the African American community really should embrace social conservatism and the social and economic conservatism of the sort that he represents. But in order for him to do that, he also has to acknowledge some realities. That it seems to me, and I think you and I disagree about this, but it seems to me that he has to say, it's really unhealthy that there's 94-5 against Republicans. I understand that there's a unique President Obama's ascendance as the first African American president is a unique event in American history, and even though I think I'm going to be a better president, I understand and respect why his presidency has a special place for a lot of people. And I also understand that the way that my own party has behaved has alienated the African American community for a long time. And I think that a Republican who wants to be taken seriously in the black community has to really discuss the divided soul of the Republican Party. And
okay.
If I were writing that speech for Romney.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I just want to interject one observation, which is, it seems to me you think Mitt Romney ought to have called attention to the special significance of Obama's presidency to the African American community by way of prefacing his appeal for the votes of African Americans. But the president himself has to walk gingerly about acknowledging the special connection that he has to the African American community because he is, after all, president of all the people. Is that not a little bit odd? I mean, Romney goes to the NAACP convention and explains to them that he appreciates the fact that there's a black president and that they are black people. Doesn't that border on almost a kind of patronization of those people? The president himself. Okay, well, you see my point? I mean,
I don't think it's patronizing. Yeah, I see the point, but I don't think it's patronizing of those people. I think it's. I mean, the fact is that it was a real milestone for America that Barack Hussein Obama was elected president, and that President Obama still faces a political dilemma because he loses whether it's 3 points or 5 points in the popular. The popular vote because of his race, and so he has to.
I'm sorry, Harold. I'm sorry.
In some ways, that's the reason.
You just made an assertion that I don't believe is true, and I don't know what the evidence is for it. His race cost him 3 to 5 points in the general election. Really?
Well, have you seen? There's a new paper by a Harvard doctoral student that uses actually Google searches and that matches Google searches. On racially charged terms, sort of R-rated racially charged terms with the turnout by county in 2008. And actually, the result turns out to be very similar to if you just difference John Kerry and Barack Obama's popular vote totals in 2004, 2008. And there's this band that goes from Oklahoma across Appalachia, West Virginia, up into Pennsylvania, where President Obama really underperformed John Kerry, and which also are the counties where you see, the most Google searches on, racialized jokes about African Americans and so on, and an econometric analysis comes out with suggests that President Obama loses. Loses a couple of points, but a couple of points. Pennsylvania being the only state that's really
my reaction to
critical.
that is he doesn't even get the Democratic Party nomination if he's not black. So I don't even know how we get to the rural counties of Pennsylvania in the general election. I mean, a consideration.
Certainly, you're right.
Consideration of the impact of Obama's race on his electoral fortunes over the last 8 years, if it's serious, has to take the whole thing into account. That convention speech that he gave in 2004, which launched his national career, doesn't make any sense but for his race. So to conclude from the analysis of the putatively racist behavior of some voters in rural Pennsylvania, that Obama's race cost him 3 or 4 points in the election is, I don't know, silly. It's certainly not a comprehensive analysis of the question. But okay, that's my view.
Well, I agree with you that as a personal politician, President Obama has, at times his race has been an asset for him, and at times it's been a cost to him, and that it's obviously complicated. But I think it's certainly the case that it just means something different for Mitt Romney. John McCain's concession speech in 2008, I think, was very gracious and made the point that, and I think that was. I think that was the right thing for McCain to have said. I think there's President Obama's personal fortunes and the way that as a political entrepreneur he uses his unique biography to his own advantage. And then there's the situation of race in broader American society, and obviously those things are different. And you can believe that President Obama has derived advantage at times from his biography. And also believe everything that I said before.
But carry on. I interrupted you.
But it just seems.
You were saying.
But it seems to me that there's independent of President Obama.
Romney has to acknowledge certain facts about the Republican Party and so on as a prelude to being able to get his audience to take him seriously as their appeal for his votes. And I'm wondering what the rest of these things are that Romney would have had to, acknowledge. And I assume to some degree apologize for or lament about his party or whatever in order to get that audience to listen to him.
So when I look at the Republican Party, I think he has certainly a tradition in the Republican Party that he can embrace. One of the great examples that I like to point to is there was an African American woman who was made the head of a post office in Mississippi, and the local white people really couldn't put up with that, and she was threatened, and the local sheriff refused to protect her, and so and the local white folks complained to the federal government, and Theodore Roosevelt went and he refused to accept this woman's resignation, and he also said to the local people, well, if she's unacceptable as the head of your post office, I guess we have to close your local post office. And he made those folks go to the next town to do their business rather than knuckle under to the intolerance of those people. And Mitt Romney's father, George Romney, it's sad that he's remembered for that brainwashing comment that he made about Vietnam. The real reason that he was not competitive in the Republican presidential field in 1968 was that in 1964 he had walked out of the Republican convention in protest over Barry Goldwater's refusal to support civil rights legislation. And I think Mitt Romney's, he needs to embrace the tradition that his father represented and acknowledge that there's another tradition. And by the way, I think things like the voter ID laws and so on are things that continue a very negative tradition within Republican politics that is pretty. In part is hostile to the minority community, and in part is basically using traditional sort of Chicago-style politics, but in a way that has such a racially disparate impact because African Americans are so overwhelmingly Democratic that some of the usual political dirty tricks you use against the other party end up having inevitably have a racial overlay to them when they occur in that context.
I don't agree with what you're saying, Harold. I think you probably could anticipate that. I don't think anyone needs to apologize for having opposed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. I think that was a perfectly legitimate position, a minority position. The position being, one of limited government powers and one of the sanctity of people's property and of the private spheres of their lives. I disagree with the position. I think it would have been historically, a disaster had the civil rights laws not been enacted in the 60s. I would have been on the other side of that. But it wasn't a moral offense to oppose those statutes. It was a difference about policy and about philosophy of governance.
I really disagree with that, Bob. Well, I'll let you finish your point, but I really disagree with that.
Okay. Secondly, I think it would have been a really stupid politics for Romney to come into a black audience and then begin to apologize to them about something that happened 50 years ago. To, in effect, say the coalition, which is substantially bolstered by my support in the South, which I lead, stands on historically rotten ground. And even though you're not going to vote for me, and I know it, please, please, please forgive us for being such bad people. Okay? I mean, who's going to say that? I mean, it'd be a little bit like a liberal Democrat coming in there and saying, I know that there's some communists and socialists lurking around the edges of my party. And in fact, I've had dinner with a few of them from time to time. I lament very much that this is the case about my party. And even though I know that you, John Birchers, are not going to vote for me, I want you to know that I'm with you in acknowledging that the communists and the socialists who have lurked around the edges of left-wing movements in this country have done damage to our national aspiration, or something of that sort. Nobody's going to say that.
Well, first of all, that analogy is extreme. It seems to me it's implausible in two different ways. First of all, you're not going in front of John Birchers. You're going in front of a huge segment of the American people, and you're going in front of a huge segment of the American people who have a real history where, yeah, it's true, a large segment of the conservative, white, Southern voting base that is now a core of the Republican Party has a real history of discriminating against African Americans, and it seems to me that it's not all decades ago, 50 years ago, and now that nice that nice Dr. King came and cleaned it up, so now we don't have to worry about it anymore, kind of thing. It seems to me that's it's a real part of living history. When I was making phone calls in 2008, I remember talking to rural African American voters in South Carolina about a lot of their experiences, and when I look at the current governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, where she opposes health reform, and she gives a kind of states, this is overly intrusive from the federal government to impose on the state the requirement to give these people health insurance. It seems to me that history matters. And
I'm sorry. Hold on a minute.
Okay. Go ahead.
Because Nikki Haley, governor of South Carolina, and there are other governors in the same position, for principled ideological reasons, do not want to expand Medicaid coverage in their states in a way that the Affordable Care Act calculates will succeed in extending medical coverage to people. Because that may be, in fact, a majority sentiment in the electorate that she represents. Because of that, somebody owes an apology to black people? I mean, because blacks are because blacks are overrepresented amongst those who might be benefited by somebody's idea of good federal policy. Anybody who, for good and sufficient reason, opposes that policy is implicitly somehow taking a racist position or needs to give an apology to black people. Let me just say.
Well, let me back up. Actually, let's back into this in a minute, because you raised one point that I didn't address, which is what do we think about opposition, the principled opposition to the Civil Rights Act in 1964? Okay. And then let's talk about that first, and then see if we can go forward from that, because I let that go. There certainly are people, Robert Bork being an example, who really raised questions about the Civil Rights Act, and people who are sometimes called sort of the non-racist opponents of the Civil Rights Act. Richard Epstein would be another person. It is true that there are people who have a view of the federal government which is independent of race, which would where the freedom of contract is given such primacy that it would lead them to oppose civil rights legislation. 2 points. One is, it is, as a matter of sort of political history and sort of political sociology, many of the people who espouse that position, I would put Barry Goldwater among them. Yeah, there was a libertarian philosophy there, but the libertarian philosophy rested quite comfortably with lots of other attitudes about race that people didn't want to present publicly, but that were certainly there. And certainly, if you look at the 1964 election and you look at the comments that Senator Goldwater and others made, there was obviously a racial dimension to their opposition to the Civil Rights Act that was a big part of it. And if you say, why is it that Nelson Rockefeller is booed off the stage pretty much, in the Cow Palace in 1964, it wasn't that a bunch of people had a view of libertarian political philosophy that they just thought, that Nelson Rockefeller was unacceptable. There was, it was deeper than that. And I think that there's a cover that this libertarian argument provides, which isn't entirely, which can't be entirely taken at face value.
I'm sorry,
for
Harold.
A lot of the people.
I stipulate
I would just
that
say
there are
that
racists in America and that they vote Republican, many of them. I stipulate that, okay? But I don't like ad hominem argument, okay? You're saying libertarian-based opposition to the Civil Rights Act is perfectly okay. You can see how Bob Bork or Dick Epstein would get there. But you're saying that you don't believe others when they mouth those libertarian arguments because you know somehow that their real reason for opposing the Civil Rights Act is that they are racist. And I could try to give an analogous ad hominem characterizations of people who suspect our president or the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, of being socialists because they advocate programs that socialists would have advocated. Yeah, they just give other reasons for advocating them. But that would be a low form of argument. And I somehow feel that what you're doing is also, you can paint the whole party with a brush based on the fact, anyway, okay, I've said my piece.
Well, by the way, I think there's some historic specificity to what I'm saying. If you look at some of the comments, and I'll stick with Senator Goldwater, where he would make comments like, we need to protect our women and things like that. He was a person of a particular time and place, and it is,
okay.
I don't think you could. I don't think you could find, the secret comments of Speaker Pelosi and so on that she wants to nationalize the steel industry or anything in a similar way. But I think this libertarian argument also is something that
I just want to.
I must say I don't accept that the libertarian argument is itself morally compelling or really. I find it odd that in when people thought about the situation of the United States in 1964 that they would have found those libertarian arguments compelling, but that's I don't know if people need to apologize for it, but I think they were just really wrong.
Come on, this is not cable television. You talk, then I talk. Okay. As it happens, I just recently reread The Conscience of a Conservative, which is Barry Goldwater's book from the 1960s. That is not a book by a racist. He's got chapters in there on civil rights. He makes the arguments that he makes. I don't find this to be, the effusions of some kind of racist. His coalition involved people whose views about race I couldn't possibly credit any way, shape, or form. But for Mitt Romney in 2012 to stand up looking back 50, 60 years back and to say about a complex political dynamic, I apologize for my party's racism. I repeat myself. I object.
Fair enough. I think, and we'll let maybe our commenters can fill us in. It is a fact that Arizona has segregated schools, and there is a lot going on historically there. But I grant you that Barry Goldwater as a person was a complicated person, and that there was a lot in what he had to say that needs to be taken seriously. But I think on this issue, he was really wrong. And I think if you want to reach the African American community, that there's a deeply rooted sense, which I think is based on real things, that the Republican Party has given the back of its hand to the black community many times. For example, the South Carolina primary this year, the way that Newt Gingrich treated Juan Williams, which we discussed previously. It seems to me there's an awful lot of instances one can point to where you can say that leading Republican politicians have done a lot to alienate the black community, and if you're seriously looking for black votes, you got to deal with that.
So, come on. Mitt Romney is not seriously looking for black votes because there are no black votes to be found by him. But what do you do with black Republicans? Okay, what do you do with? Are they self-hating? Mm-hmm. The ones who think, despite the 22 point whatever % uninsured mm-hmm. rate that you asserted for black people, mm-hmm. The ones who think that the Affordable Care Act is an overreach, is an expansion of government beyond what ought to have been countenanced, and who oppose it, in principle. Are they self-hating? Are they somehow not authentically black? I know you didn't say that.
No.
But I'm asking you because you're.
I don't believe that. I actually don't. I don't believe that at all.
Let me just finish the sentence. And I'll be done. You're ascribing political positions to black people. Now that's a race of people. That's a social collective. They don't have a common mind, So anyway, that's it.
No, I think that there is a large group of African Americans who I think would be receptive to a lot of the things that Mitt Romney might have to say. I mean, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell are Republicans. There's a lot of. In fact, I think George W. Bush. You look at a lot of the things that he did, and I think that PEPFAR, for example, was something that was a terrific thing that any president would be proud of, and that
HIV.
There's millions of people alive today in Africa. I just want people to know what
that is, Harold. Just explain what it is.
So it's the president's emergency program for AIDS relief. And there's millions of people who are alive today, or certainly hundreds of thousands, who throughout, largely in sub-Saharan Africa, but other places too, who got access to HIV medication because George W. Bush believed strongly in this and got it done, and did a fantastic accomplishment for global health that should be celebrated. And certainly,
okay.
In fact, I think George W. Bush did a number of things with regard to Africa that could be admired.
There are Republicans who did things that you and maybe some black people like. But there are also Republicans who simply are Republicans and who say things that some black people like. For example, there are pro-life Republicans, and there are pro-life black people. For example, there are Republicans who are skeptical about marriage equality, and there are black people who are skeptical about marriage equality. For example, there are Republicans who are prepared to put their faith first and say that it guides the totality of their lives and to be proud of that in public. And there are black people who think the same thing too. So that, I'm sorry, let me finish. By assuming that a Republican, in order to appeal to blacks, has first to apologize for Republican opposition to the liberal agenda, and secondly, has to extol those few Republicans who have supported one part or another of the liberal agenda, it seems to me one may be patronizing black people by projecting onto them a cluster of views which may be statistically prevalent in the black community, but which do not exhaust the potential for political commitment amongst people who happen to be black. I don't think races have a politics. Okay, that's my statement.
No, but I don't disagree with what you just said. In fact, I would love to see, for example, on the issue of school choice, I would love to see a real competition within the black community between liberal and conservative visions of what we should do about education. We have in Chicago, we have 8% of entering ninth graders are going to graduate from four-year college. So we really have
that's a horrible number. That's an unbelievable number.
Yeah, and so Chicago. I would love to see a real competition of ideas. If someone could do a school choice initiative and show me that you could do better, I'd be for it. And I certainly think that I would love to see Democratic politicians in African American heavy places feeling there's a Republican breathing over their shoulder who has competitive ideas, and that if they don't deliver for their constituents, there's a real alternative. I would love to see that. I think that it's really unhealthy that effectively the Democratic Party has a monopoly, because some of the policies that I'm obviously very liberal, but I don't think it's a good situation where there is no conservative alternative in the black community that's politically viable as offering some serious competition when we have some areas where our policies aren't working very well.
Well, as you know, one reason that there are not viable conservative ideological positions expressed vigorously within the black community is that the liberal blacks won't tolerate it, and they destroy anybody who dares to stick his head up and make such a statement. That's why you find Congressman Allen West saying the absurd kinds of things that he says, comparing the conditions of blacks to being on a plantation of the Democratic Party, to being held in slavery, and so forth and so on. I don't agree with those characterizations at all. I think, as I said, that they're absurd. On the other hand, I do agree with the sentiment behind them, which is that if you said teachers' unions who want to protect every prerogative of their jobs in the central city public school systems that are failing, and who resist any effort to introduce reforms and changes that might disadvantage them, but that would arguably be for the benefit of the kids, are not your friends. And I don't care if 50% of the members of those unions in Chicago or Philadelphia happen to be black. They're not your friends. Okay? Somebody says that, an African American or somebody seeking African American votes, and the response of the left is to go apoplectic. I agree with the conservatives who say the Democrats couldn't stand to see such a black politician gain any kind of prominence in this country, because it would expose something that's really very ugly about the character of the Democratic coalition. They take the African Americans for granted. They exploit their votes, but the coalition is unwieldy, and there's some elements of the coalition whose interests are in direct opposition, arguably, to the interests of the African American community, and that's something that can't be spoken of.
Well, that's why I think it was a lost opportunity for Mitt Romney, because the reason why one reason why the African American community is such a captive part of the Democratic coalition is because the alternative isn't there, and it's not the real passion within the Republican Party to deal with the serious problems we have in urban America. There's a rhetoric there, but I just haven't seen it delivered, and there's just too many things like this voter ID thing where the average African American voter is going to look up and say, these people really aren't our friends. And so, I don't like some of the things that the Democratic Party is doing, but I don't see these people as people that I really want to go to battle with on the other side. And I think that someone like Mitt Romney, or maybe the person who comes after Mitt Romney, has to somehow, in a much more credible way, reach out and say, there are these fundamental issues that people are worried about. Does the Republican Party have an anti-black agenda? And I've got to somehow deal with that.
Can I just say one thing? I want to say one thing about voter ID. It's a complicated issue, and I don't doubt that some of the impetus for advocating for voter ID is motivated by a political desire to suppress voting participation in constituencies that are likely to go Democratic. I'm sure that that's true somewhere down the line. On the other hand, the claim that asking people to present a government-issued identification before they vote is an anti-black move strikes me as a real stretch. I mean, it's not crazy to say, I think that when people go to vote, they ought to be able to present identification. That's not... it's like finding a racist under every bush to go from that, which a person might object to. You might have perfectly legitimate reasons to objecting to it. And it may be bad policy. It may be. I'm not clear on that, but it may be bad policy. And it may indeed have the incidental effect of raising costs of voting for people in a way that ends up negatively affecting their vote. But it's also, arguably, a plausible and reasonable way to try to secure the voting system. So, why don't we debate it on the merits?
I don't think racism. But I don't think we go to people's motives. Why don't we debate that? I just think it's hardball partisan politics that one that obviously falls on. By the way, I think if we actually had any evidence that we had an insecure voting system and that voter fraud were a widespread problem, this would be a more reasonable thing. But I think it's pretty obvious to me that this is a pretty flimsy pretext, and you just look at the way that these things are entirely being implemented on a partisan basis, and it seems to me it's pretty obvious what's going on. But I think you're right that the word racist is kind of. This is sort of.
Hold on. You have a campaign to register people to vote. Jesse Jackson used to make a big deal out of that. We're going to increase voter. Have a campaign to get them ID. I just want you to have an ID card. If you want to vote, I want you to have an ID. Get an ID. It's not an insurmountable obstacle, Harold.
No, it's not. But it's one of these things. It's another way that politicians can say, we know that if we make it more difficult and more inconvenient for a certain group of people, that we will gain a strategic advantage from that, and that's what.
No, but here's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the calculation that says, if we do this, it will suppress participation by X, depends upon the assumption that if we do this, people will not respond differently and change their behavior. And yet, the behavior that needs to be changed is simply getting an ID. It'll be a lot cheaper I would imagine, to have a mass mobilization to get people, set up sites at the public library and at the local YMCA or whatever, come in 5 minutes at a computer terminal and you got your ID. I mean, I really don't see the huge problem here. And so
first of all, I would love to see people do that. In fact, I think there should be more energy on what you're saying and less energy just criticizing the voter rights.
Okay, there you go. That's all I'm saying.
That point's been made. But then there's also a whole series of other things like limiting Sunday voting and just a bunch of stuff that I just think goes down under the category of parties in power that use their ability to mess around with the mechanics of voting procedures to gain a strategic advantage. And unfortunately, we have a political system that allows a lot of that kind of junk, because the black community is often the focus of some of this activity. It's created a bad taste in a lot of people's mouths over some rather sleazy politics that this involves, and it needs to be addressed. But I think that I think we're in agreement that it would be a good thing to see real competition between liberals and conservatives in the African American community, and to see some challenges to historic Democratic Party positions. But some of those challenges would come from conservatives. Some of them might come from people on the left too. I mean, who knows where they would come from? But it's not a good situation to have essentially a monopoly on political representation from entrenched people who are not always doing a very good job.
Okay, what else should Romney have said? What else do you think Mitt Romney, have we covered it all? Ought to have told the NAACP, which he didn't tell them.
Well, I think that again, I would just like to see him lay out some substantive conservative positions on health care. Say, okay, if the Affordable Care Act isn't the way to do it, what should we do? Because it is. I didn't assert that uninsurance number. That's from the 2010 census. The fact is that there's huge health disparities. It's funny. You're going to I want to hear about your conference on affirmative action. Affirmative action is way less important for the African American community than universal health care is in terms of the real impact on the everyday lives of millions of people. And so it seems to me he's got to get up there and say. Okay, I think it's overly intrusive to have the Affordable Care Act. Here's how I'm going to make sure that we're going to deal with the incredible disparities in, stroke fatality or whatever it is between the African American population in the United States and the non-Hispanic white population. Because that's a real problem that somebody's got to give us some real positive ways to address. And I just haven't seen it.
I agree with you that it would have been a really good thing if Romney had said to the NAACP, I intend to repeal, he called it Obamacare. I think he couldn't have called it anything else and not look like he was, pandering. But in any case, I intend to repeal the Affordable Care Act. That's my goal. That's my promise. That's what I've committed myself to. But I recognize that replace is as equally important a part of this. There was a problem. I don't agree with the way in which the president and the Democrats went about trying to address it, but I recognize it as a very serious problem, and it'll be my high priority to address it. So as I oppose and seek to repeal, I recognize the problem, and I commit to replace. I think he ought to say that regardless of the color of the audience, but I think it would have been an especially good thing for him to have said it to the NAACP. As far as affirmative action is concerned, well, the court is going to hear this case. This is going to be a big deal coming up in the fall. And, my ability to predict what's going to happen isn't all that great. But I'm not betting that the court's going to affirm it. I'd be betting if I had to bet that affirmative action would be stricken or at least significantly pushed back by what the court would do. But I agree with you that it's really not it's a symbolic issue, but it's not a substantively fundamental issue in terms of the socioeconomic standing of the African American community. There are other things like prisons, healthcare, education, urban economic development and such that are more important.
But I think the incarceration issue is a great example where we need to have. I think one of the things that encourages me about the incarceration issue is that there's a lot of conservatives and a lot of Republicans who are saying, we just have too many people locked up in America. What can we do about that? And I think there's no way that if the issue becomes ideologically polarized, I think it's very hard to see how we move forward in criminal justice in a way that will effectively reduce the number of young African American kids who are locked up. And so there's a number of areas that I think link back to our earlier conversation. There has to be a genuine. We have to somehow get out of this dynamic where there's such a correlation between liberals are concerned about issue X. It largely affects the African American community, and it's just and it's hard for us to have that conversation in a way that attracts people from a broader ideological base of people. Tell me about your trip to Nepal.
I will. Let me just make one comment on what you just said about prisons and the need for coalitions that span the ideological spectrum. I couldn't agree more. There are reasons on the left to lament the rise of mass incarceration in the United States and the racial disparity in the incidence of incarceration, and I've talked a lot about that. There are also reasons on the right to lament it, including the fact that it's a huge expansion of the power of government. Okay? You didn't like government snooping into your bedroom, taking your gun away, taxing away your income and whatnot, but you like them building this huge infrastructure of social control and coercion and having that proliferate throughout the country with the police snooping around everything and locking up millions. So if you're against big government, you ought to be worried about that as well. It costs a lot of money to run these prison systems. If you're against public spending and big employee unions and all of that, if you're a conservative, so an argument against mass incarceration that joins left and right and finds common ground to the extent that that's possible would be much healthier for the country than otherwise. I just wanted to say that. Okay.
Yeah, by the way, I think the example being prison guards when they start advocating for more stringent sentencing policies. You start to see one of the, if I'm a libertarian, it seems to me that I look at that and I say, I've seen that before.
Exactly. Let me just, as we get to the end of our talk here, you asked me about my trip, my upcoming trip. I'm leaving tonight, as it happens, to fly to Nepal, Kathmandu, to attend a conference there on affirmative action, of all things, in global perspective. No, I don't know much about Nepal. It's an interesting place, but I'm not an expert. But I do know a fair amount about the history, the policy, the political debates, the economics of affirmative action policies in the United States. So I'm going to be giving one of several keynote lectures at this 3-day conference on the subject of how affirmative action policies have evolved, what their effects have been, what their ill effects have been, what the character of the political debate around them and of the constitutional legal debate around them have been over the past 30 years. And this is meant to inform an ongoing debate within the Nepal intellectual and political classes as they transition from a Hindu monarchy to a constitutional democracy, and as they draft a new constitution on what place affirmative action-like policies should have within this new political dispensation in Nepal, which is largely Hindu society and has caste inequalities and ethnic inequalities not dissimilar to what one sees in India, where in their constitution after independence, affirmative action policies were enshrined as one of the instruments for narrowing the gap of opportunity between high and low caste Hindus in India. So that's what I'm doing in Nepal.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, man. I told everybody that I'm going global. That's my new mantra. I've grown weary of the stale domestic debates about race, but see an opportunity in this shrinking world that we live in and in the proliferation of these problems of ethnic and racial and linguistic and religious division and conflict within societies all over the world. I see an opportunity to continue to have an interesting life without having to go back over the same old tired arguments. So I'm going global, and Nepal is one of the pieces of that project for me.
I think that's so great. By the way, I'm going to brag about something, and then I'm going to bring it back to your Nepal comment. Yesterday, we had a press conference at Harper High School in Chicago announcing the results of our big randomized trial of youth violence prevention, and we actually showed that among the youth who participated in this program called BAM Sports Edition that we helped to evaluate, that their violent offending rates went down by 44% during the intervention.
Wow.
We were really proud of that. And so it was, it was just, and my colleague Jens Ludwig sort of did a masterful job of going through the intervention and various things about that. We're just so proud of the mentors who did that work.
Congratulations to you and Jens and the rest of the team. That's amazing.
Thank you. Yeah, it was an incredible amount of work. We were, in 18 schools around Chicago. But Youth Guidance and World Sport Chicago are two nonprofit agencies that did the work of it. But walking around Harper High School, which is named after the founder of the University of Chicago, I was thinking, these kids need to go global in the way that you're going global. It's a 187% segregated school as far as I can tell. It's just and all the pictures on the wall. All the little aphorisms in the hallway. They have wonderful aphorisms written up on the walls by Jesse Jackson and Oprah Winfrey and sort of the pantheon of African American celebrities. And I'm thinking, these kids are coming into the 21st century world.
Yeah.
They need to be thinking about Nepal, and they need to be thinking about what's happening in China and Vietnam and the world that they're going to inherit. And it seemed like just the way that we're these kids are being exposed to a narrower world than I'd like to see, and it's I hope that many of them get to find out about the affirmative action debate outside the United States, for example. It seems to me that would be a really interesting way to educate American kids about what are the different ways that other countries have tried to get out of this box, and what have been the accomplishments and problems that people have run into when it's not us.
Harold,
because I think we have run out of gas, and intellectually I think the Bakke case basically laid out almost all the really good arguments, and there just hasn't been a lot new.
Harold,
since,
I think I'm trying to tell you it's a brilliant idea, Harold. Let me tell you it's brilliant. Here what usually happens is. And this has happened to me. In 2005, I went over to Budapest to accept the John von Neumann Award. I'm happy to be able to report, given by a local university over there to an economist whose work has had a big influence on their students. I was stunned when I was invited to do this, because I had no idea that there were people in Budapest reading anything that I wrote. But what they were doing was they were reading my academic papers about race and inequality in the United States, and by one way or another, trying to appropriate insights from the case of African Americans in the U.S. that would be relevant to their own society. In the case of Hungary, it was largely about the situation of the Gypsies, the Roma people in Hungary. But in any case, there was that kind of cross-pollination, and it went from the U.S. and the U.S. experience and the kind of iconic example of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr., the end of Jim Crow and all of that, in the direction of countries that are democratizing and dealing with ethnic diversity and feel that they can learn from our experience. What I think is brilliant in what you just said is the direction of the arrow can be put in the other way, and that young people of color in the United States who confront the ongoing problems of their, to the extent that it's true, their social exclusion and their ethnic subordination, their inequality and their ghettoization and their segregation, that they might be able to raise their sights and broaden their horizons by informing themselves about the extent to which these problems are universal, and by knowing something about how they're being dealt with in other places in the world. It makes the world smaller for them. It makes them feel somehow less alone or isolated. It may foster hope to the extent that there are success stories and stories of successful transition that you can point to. It gives them a reason to understand themselves in much more humanistic terms and much less particularistic and narrowly sectarian or racial terms. I just think it's a great idea. We want to educate these kids in the inner city. Of course, we want them to read and write. We want them to know their history. But there wouldn't be anything at all wrong with putting some posters up on the board of, Nelson Mandela in South Africa, or putting some posters up in the board of, what's going on in Southeastern Europe with respect to the struggles of the Romani people there, or whatever it might be. Yeah, so
absolutely,
I think that's a great idea.
Absolutely. By the way, I'm gratified that you won the John von Neumann Award, because I'm probably one of your few interlocutors that has read your papers in economic theory, which are certainly you would be an appropriate recipient of a John von Neumann Award for the mathematical skill with which you've pursued your work, independent of its other virtues. So
all right, Harold.
I
guess I'm going to have you back on the Blitz show. If you're going to,
there you go.
If you're going to end like that, I mean, you're like the perfect guest.
There you go. Well, my mother taught me well.
My friend,
it was great to talk to you, and enjoy your trip. And I'll get another haircut for next time.
Okay, Harold. Take care. Bye-bye.